It is truly an honor and a joy to be with you tonight on Bedtime Tales, a space where we preserve quiet, everyday stories that often go unnoticed, yet touch the deepest corners of our hearts. In tonight's story, I invite you to listen to something deeply emotional. The journey of a mother who spent her entire life sacrificing for her children, only to walk away in silence near the end, carrying within her the long-suppressed dreams she never dared to speak aloud. This story is titled, "When a Mother is No Longer Just a Mother." Her name was Grace, a gentle, enduring woman who gave everything to her family. But as she lay on her hospital bed, clutching the hand of an old friend, she wept uncontrollably, begging to stay just a little longer, just to say goodbye. Why did she make that choice? What could drive a mother, who had always lived for others, to finally choose to live for herself? And will her children ever truly understand the heart of the woman they called Mom? These questions will slowly unfold in the moving journey that I, Thomas, am honored to share with you tonight. So now I invite you, sit back, take a breath, and listen. The house at the end of Maple Lane. At the very end of Maple Lane, tucked beneath towering crimson maple trees, stood a small wooden cottage. The paint had faded and the shutters creaked in the wind, but to Grace Whitmore, it was home, a place filled with memories, both warm and aching. Each morning, just as the mist lifted off the autumn grass, Grace would step on her creaky front porch in a thick cardigan, a steaming cup of chamomile tea in hand. The scent of herbs mixed with the earthy aroma of wet leaves and the faintest trace of cinnamon from the candle she always lit inside. She had lived in that house for over 40 years. It was where she raised her children. It was where she became a widow. Her husband, Richard, had died in a car crash decades ago, leaving her with 3 young children and a heart that never fully healed. Now in her 70s, Grace lived alone. Her days were simple. She swept the porch, fed the finches that came to her window box, tended to her modest garden of lavender and cherry tomatoes, and exchanged warm greetings with her neighbors. "Good morning, sweetheart," she'd say, her voice always soft, always kind. Though she didn't talk much, the whole neighborhood adored her. During the holidays, she would bake apple pies and deliver them to the local St. Mary's Church, where she'd place them in the charity basket with handwritten notes that read, "Love is the only thing that multiplies when you share it." Inside, the cottage was small, worn, but meticulously clean. A black and white photo of Richard rested above the fireplace mantel, next to a vintage pendulum clock that still ticked, though slightly off rhythm. Grace hadn't moved anything in the living room since the day he passed. As if by preserving its place, she could hold time still. Her children, David, Laura, and Nathan, were grown now, scattered across the country. David, the eldest, lived in New York City, working long hours in a finance firm. Laura taught elementary school in Chicago, and Nathan worked as a handyman in Texas, often moving between job sites. They called occasionally, usually on holidays or birthdays. Their conversations were brief and practical: health updates, news of utility bills, or questions about the weather. Sometimes she'd get a Christmas card with a scribbled, "Love you, Mom," added beneath the printed greeting. She kept every single one, tucked into a floral tin box on the shelf. That afternoon, sunlight streamed through the lace curtains as Grace sat alone at the kitchen table, spreading peanut butter on a slice of toast. A letter from the church lay beside her plate, inviting her to join a support group for widows and retirees. She smiled gently, folded the paper, and tucked it into a drawer. She wasn't opposed to people. She just wasn't used to talking much anymore. Silence had become her oldest friend, and yet, some days, it wrapped too tightly around her ribs. In the late afternoon, Grace went out back to water her lavender bushes. Her fingers, now thinned by age, moved with gentle familiarity. On her wrist, she wore a silver bracelet, tarnished by time, Richard's wedding gift. Though the metal had dulled, she still touched it daily, as if his voice might echo through her fingertips. Sometimes she imagined he was still there, watching from the shadows, amused by her quiet rituals. That night, the wind picked up. Maple leaves rustled like whispers across the wooden porch. Grace closed the curtains, lit the fireplace, and settled into her rocking chair by the window. On her lap was a leather-bound journal. It wasn't for stories or poetry, just thoughts she didn't have the heart to say aloud. David called yesterday, said he forgot my birthday. I told him it's okay, but truthfully, I missed him. She paused, pen in hand. Outside, the street lamp flickered, casting golden light across the frosted glass. She stared at the flames in the fireplace, how they danced and faded and flared again. There was something beautiful about how they refused to go out, even as the wood turned to ash. Somewhere in the world, there are thousands of women like Grace Whitmore. Women who quietly grow old, who count their days by the ticking of an old clock, the sound of a kettle boiling, and the weight of phone calls that never come. But Grace didn't yet know that something unexpected was waiting. Down the street, at a farmer's market, or perhaps in the most ordinary of places. A moment, a person, a connection that might make her heart stir again. Even now, the breeze carried more than just the scent of autumn leaves. It carried the first quiet promise of change. The children and the distance between them. At the far end of quiet Maple Lane, Grace Whitmore's small cottage stood calm and still each morning. But in other cities, where her 3 children now lived, the world moved with urgency, noise, and the constant hum of obligation. David, the eldest son, in a glass high-rise in Manhattan, New York, David Whitmore stared at his glowing computer screen. He was a finance director at a private investment firm, managing accounts worth millions. His days were filled with video calls, spreadsheets, and quarterly forecasts. He lived in a sleek downtown apartment with polished floors and curated art. It was comfortable, modern, and mostly silent. David rarely visited Vermont anymore. He used to come home for Thanksgiving, but in recent years, he'd settled for a quick phone call. Always short, always rushed. "Hi, Mom. Everything okay? Sorry, I've got another meeting. Let's talk soon." David considered himself a responsible son. He paid her bills. He arranged repairs on her roof. He transferred money monthly. In his mind, he had done his duty. But he never asked, "Are you lonely?" Laura, the middle child, in a modest school on the edge of Chicago, Laura was hunched over a desk, grading essays from her 8th grade students. The writing was clumsy, full of misspellings, but sincere. She smiled as she read. Laura had always loved teaching. Her classroom was bright, filled with handmade art and paper globes. But in giving her care to other people's children, she'd grown distant from her own mother. She used to be close to Grace. After their father died, it was Laura who helped her through the hardest nights. But then came college, then marriage, then divorce. And with each milestone, she called less. Lately, she dreamed of her mother often, sitting in the window light, reading in her armchair, always alone. Laura thought about calling, but the weekend would come, and the phone stayed quiet. Nathan, the youngest. In Austin, Texas, Nathan stood on the roof of a suburban home, hammering down shingles under the sweltering sun. He worked with his hands, fixing gutters, plumbing, siding, whatever needed doing. He didn't go to college. After high school, he chose freedom, living in his van when needed, taking odd jobs across the South. He didn't care for routines or calendars, but he had a tender heart. Unlike his siblings, Nathan sometimes wrote letters. "Hey, Mom, we had a thunderstorm down here. I'm fine. I miss you. Make your apple pie when I come home. Okay? Grace kept those letters in a tin box under her bed. When the house was too quiet, she'd pull them out and read them again. The distance. 3 children, 3 lives, 3 different worlds, and 1 shared silence. None of them hated her. In fact, they all loved her in their own ways. But their love had become distant, abstract, checked off like a to-do list. They didn't know that Grace still waited every evening for the phone to ring. They didn't know she'd bought an old iPhone to learn FaceTime, only to realize no one called with video. They didn't know that on snowy winter nights, she'd sit by the fire, holding a cup of cold tea, staring at the window pane, wondering if anyone remembered. Childhood had vanished. The children who once ran through her garden laughing, calling Mom, were now adults, busy, successful, and far away. The distance wasn't measured in miles, but in missed moments, in unspoken words, in the echo of a mother's heart beating quietly in a house at the end of a sleepy street. Grace kept smiling, watering her lavender, baking for the church, waving at neighbors like all was well. But something inside her had begun to hollow out, something none of her children had noticed. Not yet. The fateful encounter. One crisp October morning, with golden light filtering lazily through the maple trees, Grace Whitmore wrapped herself in a soft cream shawl, pulled on a wide-brimmed hat, and set off down the sidewalk toward the weekly farmers market in town. It was a small tradition, nothing grand, but one she cherished deeply. Not for the shopping itself, but for the feeling of being among people, surrounded by voices, the smells of fresh apples and cinnamon bread, the laughter of neighbors, and the simple buzz of a place that felt alive. It gave her, if only briefly, a sense of belonging. The market was set up just beside St. Mary's Church, a collection of canvas tents, homemade signs, and local farmers selling jars of honey, jam, herbs, and hand-woven baskets. Grace strolled gently through the stalls, her steps light, her eyes scanning for fresh basil and tomatoes. She paused at a wooden stand decorated with hanging lavender and potted herbs. As she picked through a cluster of basil leaves, a voice beside her spoke, warm and rich. "Careful now. Those little herbs have a way of charming anyone who loves pasta." She turned. An older man stood beside her, perhaps 70, tall with neatly combed white hair and twinkling blue eyes behind round-rimmed glasses. He wore a checkered flannel shirt under a dark gray vest and held a woven basket full of lavender and cherry preserves. "I should know," he added with a gentle laugh. "I've fallen victim more than once." Grace smiled. "Grace Whitmore." "Robert Callahan," he said, offering his hand. The handshake was light, but steady, like brushing against a memory. Something familiar, something warm. Robert lived in a nearby town, just 20 minutes away. He was a retired art teacher who had lost his wife to cancer nearly a decade ago. Since then, he had lived alone in a lakeside cottage, filling his days with gardening, woodworking, and caring for a stray orange cat who had, over time, become his best friend. They spoke briefly about basil, tomatoes, and how autumn always came too quickly before parting ways. Grace made her way toward the bread stall while Robert lingered, watching her go with a look that held more curiosity than he expected. The following Saturday, they crossed paths again. This time, Robert offered her a taste of his homemade raspberry jam. They stood beside his modest table, nibbling biscuits, sipping apple cider, and talking like old neighbors who had somehow never met. "I've always believed it's never too late to make a new friend," he said. "I believe that too," Grace replied. "I was just waiting for someone else to go first." From then on, their Saturday mornings became routine. Sometimes they walked through the market together. Other times they sat on a park bench and watched the leaves fall. The conversation was never forced. It just flowed, stories about childhood, gardening tips, favorite books, and silent moments that were surprisingly comforting. Robert told her about his late wife, an artist who laughed often and painted everything in shades of orange. Grace shared stories about Richard, her quiet, steady husband, and the way he used to fix the screen door every fall even when it didn't need fixing. Those memories no longer stung. Instead, they were soft and well-worn, like the corners of a favorite blanket. One late afternoon, Robert invited her to visit his cottage. Nestled by a small lake and surrounded by golden trees, it looked like something from a painting. Inside, the scent of cedar wood and old books greeted her. There were paintings on the walls, a kettle on the stove, and a chair by the window overlooking the water. "I'm building a rocking chair," he said, gesturing toward a half-finished piece in the corner. "Thought maybe you'd like to read here someday." Grace didn't answer right away. She just smiled, gently, like a falling leaf finally choosing where to land. That night, back in her own home, Grace set her market bag on the table and brewed a cup of chamomile tea. But her thoughts weren't in the kitchen. They were still there, by the lake, near the rocking chair, beside the scent of cedar and lavender. She glanced at the old photograph of Richard on the mantel and whispered softly, "I'm not betraying you. I just want someone to grow old with." It wasn't about romance. It wasn't about replacing the past. It was about something simpler: understanding, companionship, peace. Sometimes, life offers us a moment we didn't expect, an encounter we didn't plan. And sometimes, the heart recognizes it, even before the mind does. Grace Whitmore, a woman who had lived quietly for over 30 years, now stood on the threshold of something new. Not loud, not dramatic, but deeply real. And in that quiet corner of Vermont, with leaves dancing in the wind, something in her life had quietly begun again. The wall called family. News traveled faster than intentions. Grace Whitmore hadn't told anyone about Robert. Not truly. It was nothing official, nothing romantic, just shared moments, simple joys. But during a phone call with Laura one afternoon, she had casually mentioned, "I went to the farmer's market with Robert last weekend. He grows lavender just like me." There was a pause, then a quiet, almost surgical question. "What kind of friend is he, Mom?" The echo from David. A few days later, David called. Not during his usual lunch break. Not with his usual pleasantries. It was late. Too late for small talk. "Mom, Laura said something. Are you seeing someone?" His voice was calm, but laced with something cold, like suspicion disguised as concern. "He's just a friend, David. We talk. We laugh. He's kind. Have you thought about Dad?" Grace felt the words tighten around her chest. "David, your father passed away 30 years ago. I don't care. What do you think people will say? Do you think this looks appropriate? For a woman your age?" She held the phone tighter, the cool plastic pressing against her palm like a quiet rebuke. "I haven't done anything wrong, David." But there was no warm goodbye. Just a click, a silence. A door softly closed without ever opening. Laura's caution. Laura didn't shout. She didn't even raise her voice. But her words cut anyway, like scissors trimming away something sacred. "Are you sure he's not taking advantage of you, Mom? Older people are vulnerable." "I'm old, Laura. I'm not foolish. I don't want to see you betray Dad's memory." Grace flinched. That word, betray, landed with more weight than Laura could ever understand. Had she not been loyal? Had she not sacrificed enough? Years of raising children alone, holidays spent in quiet, grief stitched into every birthday cake? Was a walk through a farmer's market enough to erase 3 decades of devotion? Grace said nothing. She didn't know what to say to a child who measured loyalty with loneliness. Nathan's silence. Only Nathan didn't call. Instead, he sent a message. "Mom, if this man makes you happy, then be happy. I trust you to know what's right." Just one sentence. But it filled her with tears. not from pain, but from relief. It didn't take many words to feel understood. Sometimes it took only the right ones. David arrives. 1 week later, David arrived at her doorstep, unannounced, uninvited, still in his work suit. The knot of his tie slightly loosened, but his expression tense and tight. He didn't sit down, didn't take off his coat. "Mom, this isn't okay. You don't know this man. You're not young anymore. What if he's after your money?" Grace sat quietly at the kitchen table. The tea had gone cold. The cookies remained untouched on the plate. "You're upset because I have a friend?" she asked softly. "I'm upset because it's not necessary. Dad will be disappointed." "Have you ever asked me what I want, David?" she whispered. "For 30 years, I've lived for my children. I've never once asked to live for myself." David's eyes flickered. The room felt still, too still. In a moment of frustration, he reached across the table and grabbed her phone. "You don't need this," he snapped. "You don't need to be messaging strangers at your age." The phone clattered onto the hardwood floor. The sound echoed, louder than any argument. Grace didn't cry. She didn't scream. She simply looked at her son, and in that silence, there was more pain than words could hold. That night, she didn't sleep. She sat in her rocker, staring at the flames in the fireplace, writing in her worn leather journal. "As a mother, I've never complained. But as a person, I want to feel alive just once." Then she packed a small bag. She took her silver wedding bracelet, the one Richard gave her on their wedding day, and held it close. She looked at his photo on the mantel. "I'm sorry, my love, but I'm tired." The next morning, the house at the end of Maple Lane was quiet. The porch was still swept. The kettle was clean. The bed was made. But Grace was gone. On the kitchen table was a handwritten note. "My dear children, I'm not leaving to escape. I'm leaving to live. Don't look for me. Not unless you're truly ready to understand me." The hidden letter. The house at the end of Maple Lane had never felt so still. Sunlight streamed gently through the lace curtains, casting soft patterns on the hardwood floor. But the silence inside was different now, heavier, colder. The warmth of chamomile tea, the hum of the kettle, the soft rhythm of a rocking chair, all gone. Grace Whitmore had left, and all she had left behind was a cracked phone on the floor, a tidy home, and a handwritten note that hung in the air like unanswered prayer. 3 children, 3 reactions. David drove straight back to New York in silence. He didn't turn on the radio, didn't answer calls. The road blurred past him, but nothing could outrun the ache growing in his chest. When he arrived home, he opened the fridge to grab a bottle of water and saw the tin of cookies his mother had mailed weeks ago, untouched. He sat down on the kitchen floor, and for the first time in years, he cried. Laura skipped school that day, caught the next flight to Vermont, and arrived just after noon. She walked through the empty house slowly, like stepping into a memory. Everything was exactly where it had always been. Her mother's scarf hanging over the back of the armchair, dried lavender in a vase on the kitchen windowsill, a half-read book on the tea table. On the mantel sat an old photograph, Grace with her 3 young children, all arms and laughter. And for the first time in a long time, Laura wondered, did we ever really know her? Nathan arrived later that evening. He didn't ask questions. He didn't try to explain anything. He simply sat on the porch steps, watching the yellow leaves drift down from the maples. He knew his mother hadn't left in anger. She hadn't left to punish. She had left because she had spent most of her life being a mother and not nearly enough time being a person. The discovery, while Laura was tidying up Grace's bedroom, she opened the drawer of the nightstand. Inside was a small wooden box tied with a faded lavender ribbon. Curious, she opened it. Inside were several folded letters, carefully stacked and worn at the creases. The top letter was written in blue ink, the handwriting neat and slanted. To Grace, the woman who made my old heart feel young again. I never expected to look forward to Saturdays like a child waiting for spring. I never imagined that a cup of tea and a few shared stories could make me feel alive again. If you let me, I'll build a second rocking chair for you. Not to keep you still, but to give you a place to lean. Robert. Laura sat frozen. She read the letter again, then a third time. Her hands trembled. She called David and Nathan into the room. Together, the three of them sat around the kitchen table, reading the rest of the letters. Some were long, some short, but all were thoughtful, kind, and full of something their mother hadn't received in a very long time: gentle care. There were no grand declarations of love, no drama, just quiet respect. I made a new shelf for your tea tins. Come see it if you like. I planted extra lavender for spring, if you still enjoy the scent. I saved you the last jar of jam, not because I'm sweet, but because I know you are. In those pages, Grace's children saw something they had never truly seen before. A woman who had kept her heart alive in silence, and a man who had found it and honored it. The truth. Nathan spoke first. We didn't see her. Not really. We only saw what we expected her to be. David looked down at his hands, his voice low. She never asked for anything. Laura wiped her tears. All these years she just gave, and we never asked if she needed anything in return. There was a stillness in the room, and in that stillness, something began to crack, not in anger, but in understanding. The wall between them and their mother had not been made of distance or years. It had been built from assumptions, silence, and fear. A final message. Among the letters was a small card, written in Grace's unmistakable hand. If someday you wish to see me again, not as your mother, but as a woman with her own story, come to the little cabin by Silver Pine Lake. Robert will be there. And if I'm still there too, then maybe I haven't given up hope on you yet. The story wasn't over, but for the first time in a long time, it wasn't being written by a mother's sacrifice. It was being rewritten by her children's awakening, not to guilt, but to grace. The confrontation and the letting go. The early winter sunlight lay like silk over the hills, brushing the last golden leaves that clung to the trees. The air was crisp but soft, filled with the scent of damp earth and wood smoke. The cabin by Silver Pine Lake stood quietly among the trees. Smoke drifted from the chimney. A small garden of lavender grew beside the porch. And on the wooden deck, a single rocking chair swayed gently in the breeze. The second chair was still missing. The journey. David, Laura, and Nathan arrived in silence. The drive had been long, but the weight they carried was heavier than miles. Each one wondered the same thing, though none dared speak it aloud. Was she welcome them? Or had they already lost her for good? David stepped out first. He walked to the door and raised his hand to knock. But before he could, it opened. Grace Whitmore stood there, wrapped in a soft blue sweater, a steaming cup of tea in her hand. She said nothing. She didn't smile. She simply stepped back and left the door open. The confrontation. They followed her into the small, warm cabin. The fire crackled in the hearth. The smell of mint tea and cedar filled the air. Everything was simple, clean, peaceful, very little like the home they had grown up in. David looked around. Something about this place felt whole. "We came to see you," Laura said gently. Grace didn't reply. She sat down at the small round table and placed her cup down beside a worn leather journal. David cleared his throat. "We're not here to argue." Still, she said nothing. Laura stepped closer. "We read the letters from Robert. We understand." Something flickered in Grace's eyes. Nathan, standing near the doorway, added, "You deserve to be happy, Mom. I'm sorry we forgot that. Truth that cuts." Grace finally spoke. There were nights I sat alone in the dark just hoping someone would call. Not to ask about the bills or the weather, just to ask if I was okay. Her voice didn't tremble. It was steady calm, too calm. I never needed anyone to take care of me. I just needed to be seen. But the older I got, the more you tried to manage me like a fragile object. David lowered his head. You thought I needed protecting, but what I needed was space to breathe, to feel like I wasn't just a function, a mother, a caretaker, a relic. Laura began to cry. We didn't mean to hurt you. You didn't mean to, Grace said softly, but you did. You made me feel ashamed for finding joy again. You made me believe that my life was only valuable when it was given away. The silence in the room grew thick, full of unspoken things. Then she looked at David. You took my phone from me. You made me feel like a child being punished. And all because I had a friend. David's voice cracked. I was afraid. Afraid someone would take advantage of you. Grace looked at him, not with anger, but with something far deeper. Sadness. I wasn't afraid. Not of loneliness. Not of judgment. I was only afraid that I'd die before anyone saw me for who I really was. A new kind of goodbye. After a long pause, she continued. I'm not angry. I'm just tired. Tired of pleasing. Tired of pretending. This is the first time I've lived for myself. David stepped forward, tears in his eyes. Do you want us to leave? She looked at him for a long moment. No, but if you stay, it has to be as people who listen, not as people who command. It was the final lock clicking open. Laura stepped forward and wrapped her arms around her mother, not as a daughter reaching out to the woman who raised her, but as a woman finally seeing the one who had always been hidden behind the title of mom. Nathan walked in from the porch and placed a small wooden box on the table. Inside was a handcrafted rocking chair, carved with care and sealed with oil. For you, he said, in case Robert never finished the second one. This is mine. For you. Not an ending, a beginning. That night they sat by the fire. No big speeches, just warmth, presence, and the quiet hum of something healing. The next morning, they packed their things. Grace walked them out to the porch. Her eyes were soft, her shoulders lighter. Before getting into the car, David turned to her. Will you ever come back to Maple Lane? She smiled. I won't go back to where I'm only allowed to be what others expect. I'll stay where I'm allowed to be myself. And with that, the goodbye they shared was no longer filled with sorrow. It was a release, a beginning of a new kind of love, rooted not in sacrifice, but in recognition. The journey to find a real mother. Winter came quietly to Silver Pine. It wasn't harsh like in the northern cities, but enough to ice the edge of the lake in the early mornings and send thin trails of smoke curling from chimneys. Grace Whitmore's cabin, once a place to retreat from a lifetime of expectations, had become something entirely different, a new beginning. Small changes, quiet transformations. After that final conversation, her 3 children didn't immediately return to their old lives. David, once ruled by spreadsheets and deadlines, began to write handwritten letters to his mother, not just to ask how she was or to fulfill an obligation, but to share stories. A song he'd heard at a cafe that reminded him of childhood, a rainy Tuesday in Manhattan that brought back the smell of her cinnamon bread. For the first time in decades, Grace saw the boy behind the businessman. She learned that her son, her serious, polished, always in control son, had feelings he'd buried beneath layers of success. Laura, after returning to Chicago, took 2 weeks off from teaching. Not because she was tired, but because she needed time to write a book. The working title, The Woman Behind the Word Mother. In its pages, she wrote about the things no one had noticed. The sleepless nights with sick children. The silent grief after her husband's death. The quiet strength behind every home-cooked meal. Laura had always believed she understood her mother best. Now she realized she had only understood the role, not the woman. Nathan, the quiet one, spoke less but acted more. Every month, he drove across state lines to visit his mother. No warning, no fanfare. Sometimes he chopped wood. Sometimes he fixed the porch. Sometimes he simply sat beside her, sipping tea, saying nothing at all. And Grace knew. This was his apology, his love, spoken in the language he knew best. Grace, living as herself. Now that her children no longer looked at her as a role to be filled, but as a person to be known, Grace felt lighter. She no longer had to smile when she was sad. She no longer had to pretend she didn't want companionship, art, or joy. She kept a journal. She painted soft watercolors of the lake. She knitted scarves with a small circle of women in town. And every weekend, she met with Robert. A gentle relationship. She and Robert never called themselves lovers. They simply said they were companions. The second rocking chair was finished now. They sat on the porch, sipping tea, sometimes reading, sometimes just watching the trees. Robert didn't try to replace Richard, her late husband. He was simply a new melody after a long, silent song had ended. And Grace, for the first time, understood. Happiness doesn't have to be loud. It doesn't have to be perfect. It just has to be real. From her journal, my children found me again. Not where I used to live, but where I finally became myself. I spent most of my life being a mother, but I'm grateful that in the last chapter of it, I've been allowed to be Grace. And so, no one knew how many years Grace had left, but everyone who saw her from that moment on knew this. She was no longer living to be enough for others. She was living fully and gently, to simply be herself, and to be loved for exactly that. The final dream. Spring arrived late in Silver Pine. The snow melted slowly, revealing dark, damp soil beneath the garden beds. The lavender, asleep for months, had begun to push up new shoots. The wind was still cool, but the sunlight lingered just long enough to warm the porch. On the wooden deck of the small cabin, two rocking chairs sat side by side. On the table between them, a cup of chamomile tea gently steamed next to an open book. There were no voices, just the whisper of wind through the trees and the soft rustle of turning pages. Grace Whitmore was living the final chapter of her life, not in fear, not in regret, but in a quiet, earned contentment. A day like any other but whole. Each morning, she rose at 6, brewed her tea, and sat by the window to write in her journal. Today, the lavender bloomed. The cold isn't as sharp as yesterday. A good day to keep smiling. Robert would arrive shortly after, bringing toasted bread and fresh berries from market. They ate slowly, listened to jazz on an old radio, and spoke in fragments, if at all. There was nothing they needed to prove to each other. Their companionship required no declarations. The memory box. One afternoon, feeling her strength fading, Grace took a small tin box from her closet. Inside were a black and white wedding photo of her and Richard, an unsent letter to her children, a leather-bound journal titled The Final Dream. She hadn't written grand confessions, just humble human wishes. I wish I could sit beside my daughter without needing to be perfect. I wish I could hold Robert's hand to the market without worrying what my children would think. I wish every woman could choose joy at any age. She placed the box gently on a shelf and labeled it. For my children, when I'm gone, a sunset without fear. One evening, as the sky turned to gold over the lake, Grace whispered to Robert, "I'm not afraid of dying anymore." He didn't answer immediately. He simply took her hand, held it softly. She continued, "Dying isn't as scary as living wrongly. I spent so much of my life pleasing everyone else. Now, I have nothing left to regret." Robert said nothing. He leaned over and kissed her forehead, not as a goodbye, but as a quiet, grateful thank you. The dream. That night, Grace dreamed something unlike any other. She was young again, barefoot in a white dress, walking through a purple field. Far ahead, Richard stood, smiling, not beckoning, just waiting. When she reached him, he extended his hand and whispered, If there's anything left you haven't lived for yourself, go back. I'll wait. Grace turned. Behind her was the cabin, Robert on the porch, the scent of chamomile, the sound of finches singing. She woke the next morning, weaker, slower to move, but with a soft light in her eyes. "I'm still here," she whispered. One more day, one more morning sun, and that, to her, was enough. From her final journal entry, "Maybe tomorrow I'll be gone, but if you're reading this, please remember, don't wait until the end of your life to begin living it. Love boldly, laugh honestly, make mistakes if they make you feel alive. Be someone you can recognize in the mirror, not just for others, but for yourself. Forgiveness and farewell." The morning Grace Whitmore passed away, the sky was impossibly clear. The surface of Silver Pine Lake was glass still, reflecting a pale, flawless sky. The lavender by the porch swayed gently in the breeze, as if bowing in goodbye. Robert found her just after sunrise. She was still sitting in her rocking chair, her hand resting softly on her journal, her eyes closed, as though simply napping between moments of peace. She had passed quietly, like a candle burning to its very end, without struggle, without sorrow. Her final words. Robert called Grace's 3 children, David, Laura, and Nathan. They arrived within the day. The cabin remained untouched, warm with the scent of cedar and dried flowers. On the table was the tin box, carefully labeled, "For my children when I'm gone." Inside, they found a letter, written in Grace's graceful handwriting, still steady, still full of care. "To my dear children, if you are reading this, I've likely gone on ahead, but don't mourn me. I left with a smile and a heart finally at peace. I want you to know that I forgive you, not because you were wrong, but because I understand. We all grow up. We all get busy. We all get afraid in our own ways. David, thank you for coming back. You always try to be strong, but I'm most proud of you when you let yourself be human. Laura, thank you for writing me into your story, not as a mother, but as a woman. You gave me space to exist as someone more than a role. Nathan, thank you for the silence that always felt like listening. In your quiet ways, you made me feel most seen. I don't need you to change who you are. I only hope that, as you grow older, you'll remember, to love someone is not to control them, but to let them be free. I loved you not for who you were expected to become, but because you were mine, chosen, held, loved with everything I had. Live a life that, when you're at your own end, you won't regret the moments you lived for someone else's expectations. Love, forgive, start over if you must. It's never too late. With love, Mom, Grace ***. A farewell without tears. Grace's memorial was exactly as she'd wished. Simple, warm, free of mourning. There were no black clothes, no eulogies, only her favorite jazz music, hand-picked lavender bouquets, and wooden chairs arranged in a circle. Neighbors shared small stories. She brought me bread every Friday. She gave me lavender seeds when I lost my husband. She didn't talk much, but when she did, it stayed with you. After the goodbye, that evening, her 3 children remained in the cabin. They didn't speak of grief. They spoke of Grace, not as a mother, but as a woman they were only just beginning to understand. Laura opened Grace's final journal and read aloud. "Tomorrow I may not be here, but today I breathe. I love, I write, and that is enough. If I go tomorrow, let me go as a woman finally free, no longer bound by duty or role or expectation." David poured tea. Nathan tended the fire. Laura hummed an old lullaby Grace used to sing when they were small. For the first time, they weren't just children performing for their mother's approval. They were people learning how to love in new, unpracticed ways. Grace remained. Grace was gone in body, yes, But she remained, in handwritten letters, in soft porch sunrises, in the warmth of lavender, in the memory of a woman who had finally lived as herself and been loved for it, not for what she gave, not for what she carried, but for who she quietly was all along. The end. I believe that at some point in our lives, all of us stand at a crossroads between duty to others and the quiet yearning within ourselves. How many times have you asked yourself, am I really living for me, or just for the expectations of others? The story of Grace reminds me of something powerful. Happiness doesn't wait for permission. It begins when we dare to choose. After a lifetime of giving, Grace chose just once to live for herself, not out of selfishness, but out of truth. So don't wait until the end to start living honestly. Don't let the eyes of others or the invisible ropes inside your own heart hold you back. Let me ask you this. What is keeping you from choosing joy today? Is it the fear of judgment, or is it yourself? Share your story in the comments below. I'd truly love to hear it. And if this story touched something inside you, please consider subscribing to Bedtime Tales so we can continue exploring these deeply human stories together. Also, tell me, where are you listening from? Let's weave a map of hearts across every corner of this world. Until next time, keep listening and keep feeling.